After recovering from my illness, I returned to my home country, only to find an additional girl by Cell's side. Everyone claimed she was merely a replacement for me and urged me to be more understanding. Yet I alone knew the truth. Cyril had fallen for my substitute. If she left without saying a word, Cyril would go mad. Why had I come back? It might have been better if I hadn't. If she had suffered a miscarriage, Cyril would have sought revenge on me, driving me into bankruptcy, causing blindness, or leading me to fall from a building. That was my life, my entire existence. When I finally opened my eyes again, I couldn't wait to call off the engagement. But this time, he was determined to die rather than let go. On the day I arrived back, Cyril didn't even come to meet me. I checked my phone, and the message I sent him before my flight still hadn't been responded to. A bitter smile appeared on my lips. He must still be angry with me for leaving without explanation. As I stood in the busy airport, my heart ached with longing for Cyril. Would he miss me? After getting in the car, I instructed the driver to take me straight home instead of heading to Cyril. I wanted to see my family first, as they had endured so much while I was ill. Now that I was better, I hoped to bring them joy. This thought made me smile as the large black car moved slowly through traffic, and I drifted into a drowsy sleep. When I awoke, it felt as if something was choking me, and I could hardly breathe. In my dream, I saw Cyril with the girl, kissing, tangled in each other's embrace. I dreamt that Cyril and I were engaged as promised, and the girl departed, her heart dead inside. Cyril pushed me to the ground, his hands around my neck. Are you satisfied now? Do you think I'll love you forever if you get rid of her? Don't dream, Seraphina. No matter how you force her out, I'll make you beg her to come back. I shook my head in the dream, tears streaming down my face. I hadn't done anything, yet he blamed everything on me. I was the one who was right, but somehow I had become the third party. Later, I saw how Cyril, disregarding his pride, used every method to keep the girl close, always protecting her, fearing that I might hurt her. Then I heard she was pregnant. I wanted to ask her, "Are you sure you want to have an illegitimate child?" But before I could approach her, she fell down the stairs and miscarried. Cyril went mad, using every tactic to ruin my family. My parents were pushed to suicide, and my brother was beaten so severely by creditors that both his legs were amputated. In the dream, I saw myself dressed in white, fragile and defenseless. I took one step forward, my heart aching. Your brother is ahead. Just one more step. With a sudden, painful noise, I felt myself plummet from a tall building. My fall was endless. The driver's voice broke me from the nightmare. "Miss, what's wrong? You look pale. Did I drive too fast?" I slowly became aware that I was still in the car. The driver looked worriedly into the rearview mirror. I trembled as I picked up my phone, struggling to hold it. After a few moments, I told the driver, "Uncle Lee, don't go home. Take me to the Cloud Club." Cyril had a private box there, where he and his childhood friends would gather when he wasn't busy. When we arrived, the box was quiet. I spotted Cyril immediately, sitting with a cold expression, his head lowered. Beside him was a slender girl who leaned close, her eyes sparkling as she tried to make him laugh. Despite his cold demeanor, a smile tugged at Cyril's lips, showing an intimacy I hadn't expected. He could be like that with other women too. I supported myself against the doorframe to avoid collapsing. It was real. The substitute, his love for her. It was all true, just as I had dreamed. Someone with sharp eyes spotted me and shouted, "Damn it! Seraphina's back! Cyril, you really know how to hide things!" Cyril raised his head and a fleeting panic crossed his face. He walked toward me, but when the girl behind him called his name, he paused. His voice, as cold and arrogant as always, held an affection that was almost palpable. "Seraphina," he said, his eyes turning red with emotion. "Damn it! You're finally back. I thought you didn't want me anymore." Looking at his face, the one I had once loved so deeply, my heart almost shattered. I held back my tears and asked, "Who is she?" Cyril instinctively moved to the left, blocking my view of her. His posture was defensive, and his eyes were alert. "Nobody," he said quickly. "Just someone irrelevant." At that moment, his friends rushed to explain. "Ophelia just works part-time here. She was just here by chance. Don't misunderstand Seraphina. Cyril has nothing to do with her." The crowd around me pressed in, a dark, suffocating mass, closing in and forming a barrier that separated me from them. These people had watched me grow up and had witnessed my relationship with Cyril for over 10 years. It seemed they intentionally placed her in the least noticeable spot, but everything they said was in her defense. I understood that on the surface, they appeared to be supporting me, but behind my back, they kept referring to Ilia as sister-in-law one after another. They even went as far as advising Cyril, saying, "Ilia is the best match for you. You two are clearly meant for each other. Why bother with Seraphina? Who's such a tough challenge?" Yes, Alia loved him deeply. Despite how he treated her, she never complained. If it had been Seraphina, she would have caused a huge scene by now. Yes, I had been born into wealth, and I would never demean myself for anyone. Not even Cyril could make me do that. So I would never degrade myself or speak softly, just as I would never be as frail as Ilia was in that moment. She looked like a fragile flower with nothing to rely on, her eyes close to breaking, which made the men around us feel pity for her. Cyril grabbed my wrist firmly and said in a low voice, "Take her out, now." The man next to Ilia immediately helped her up. "Let's go. Don't you still have work to do?" Alia lowered her head and began to leave, but stopped at the door. "Cyril, I don't believe you can't tell the difference between me and her. I trust you know who you truly love. When you figure it out, come to me. I'll be waiting." After saying that, she straightened up and walked out without looking back. Cyril, standing beside me, was so tense, it was as if he were an arrow ready to be fired. I glanced at my wrist, which he had nearly crushed, and smiled faintly. "Cyril, it hurts." He seemed to snap out of his daze, immediately releasing my hand and apologizing. "Sorry. I'll have someone bring the first aid kit." I rubbed my wrist and decided firmly, no need. "I'm going home." But I saw his gaze linger on Ailia's retreating figure, unable to help himself. "I'm going home," I said again. "I need to see my parents and brother." He parted his lips, but no words came out, then reached out to embrace me. The dream images rushed back, overwhelming me. I felt sick and cried out, "Don't touch me!" Cyril immediately stepped back, raising his hands. Okay, I won't touch you. I'll have someone take you home. Be good." I lifted my head and gave him one final look. Under the bright lights, he hadn't asked a single question since I arrived. Nothing about my health, no concern about the pain I'd endured. He didn't even offer to take me home. Later, I heard that he chased after Ilia. They caused a big scene at the club entrance. Word spread that Sorel had fallen for a poor female college student and almost destroyed the club for her. It was said they argued, kissed, and then he forced her into his car. The car headed toward their villa in the suburbs. He couldn't bring himself to admit that he had fallen for a replacement. But what had all this been? While I fought to recover, hoping to build a future with him, he was kissing Ilia. It became clear. Love can be fleeting. In those nights when I barely held on, Cyril had been one of the reasons I persevered. But perhaps love that can be replaced isn't love at all. In this life and the past one, my love for you has come to an end, Cyril. I'll be magnanimous and support your relationship with Ilia. I wish you both a happy life together. When I arrived home, my mother was both shocked and anxious. You naughty child, why didn't you tell us you were coming back? What did the doctor say? Did he approve of your return? How's your health? Are you feeling unwell anywhere? Oliver, carry your sister upstairs quickly. I quickly hugged her. Mom, I'm not that fragile. I'm almost fully recovered now. The doctor said I just need to take good care of myself. Oliver, my brother, also known as Shadu, came downstairs in his slippers with a slap sound. He had visited me in the US just last week. When he saw me, he pinched my cheek and casually said, "You're so bold. You came back without even telling your brother." I lazily collapsed on the sofa, inhaling the familiar scent of home. I wanted to surprise you. Looking at Oliver, all intact, the memory of his legs being broken in the past life flashed in my mind. I quickly sat up straight and hugged him tightly. I'm so sorry." Oliver pretended to shiver dramatically. "Mom, look. My sister's even apologizing to me. She's really grown up." He patted my head. "There's nothing to apologize for. I'm your brother. Whatever you do is fine. No need for sorry or thank you, got it?" Mom gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, gazing at both of us tenderly. I turned to her and said the words that had been on my mind throughout the journey home. My voice was thick with bitterness, as though filled with dry sand. "Mom, cancel the engagement between the Shin and Sorel families. I don't want to marry Sorel anymore." My mother was so stunned. She couldn't speak for a moment. She knew how long I had dreamed of marrying Sorel since childhood. "What's happening? Your father and I were planning to discuss with the Sorel family and set the wedding date. This is such a wonderful thing. Why are you suddenly saying you don't want to marry him? We've been childhood sweethearts from families of equal standing. A perfect match. Our marriage has always been a dream come true." I blinked, my heart heavy despite the decision I had already made. Yet every time I thought about it, the pain seemed unbearable. "Mom, I don't want to. I just can't marry him anymore," I said, tears flowing down my cheeks, one after another, landing on the back of my hand. "Serafina, you're so helpless. You're so miserable just because you don't want to marry him. Fine. If you don't want to, then don't. Your father and I will handle it," my mother said, wiping away my tears and gently comforting me. Oliver, who was standing next to me, spoke up, his tone full of curiosity. "You've been blind for over 10 years, so why did you suddenly open your eyes today?" I glared at him and immediately turned to my mother. "Mom, look at him!" Only then did I recall that Oliver had always seemed a bit dissatisfied with Sorel. Every time he tried to speak ill of him in front of me, I would always defend Sorel. In hindsight, he was right. I had been blind for more than 10 years. The Cyril family was not just any family, and the Shin family was also well known. Ending the engagement would not be simple. The Shin family had made a public announcement about cancelling the engagement, which caused quite a stir. Over the past few days, the internet had been buzzing with activity, and the Cyril side had been unsettled. I heard that when the news reached Cyril, he kicked the messenger hard. He refused to accept the cancellation, believing I was just throwing a tantrum. The head of the Cyril family gave an order that even though I didn't want to see Cyril, I still had to. When I arrived, Cyril was sitting in a corner of the sofa, holding a cigarette between his fingers. His brothers, who had been sitting beside him, immediately stood up when they saw me, their previously arrogant expressions turning submissive. "Sister-in-law, hello. Sister-in-law, you're here." The repeated calls of sister-in-law sounded harsh to my ears. I curled my lips and gave a forced smile. "Don't call me that. There's no sister-in-law here." Cyril stood up slowly and placed the cigarette into a wine glass. He gave a small, displeased smile without even looking up at me. He walked toward me, and his hand holding the cigarette brushed my cheek. Somehow he looked sad. "Are you still upset with me? You left without a word for so many years, and I never blamed you. But now, as soon as you come back, you want to cancel our engagement. Do you really forget how long I've been waiting for you?" I turned away from his hand to avoid his touch. Hearing his words, I almost laughed out of frustration. His brothers, who had always followed him, began to support him as soon as he started complaining. "Yeah, Sister Serafina, since we were kids, no one has ever dared to treat Cyril like this. He only makes an exception for you. Of course, in the whole city, the only one who can make our Cyril bow is our sister-in-law." I cut them off coldly. "Wait, did you find a replacement waiting for me? Cyril, isn't it revolting for you to say that?" His face changed and his brows furrowed. "What replacement? Where did you hear that, Serafina? Do you trust me so little?" Just as I was about to speak, a disturbance caught our attention. The bar was open, so we could see everything happening around us. The noise drew our attention, and not far away, a group of men was stopping a girl who appeared to be a waitress. In a place like this, where wealthy and powerful people often gathered, such things weren't out of the ordinary. But the girl being stopped was holding a tray close to her chest and gazing at us. It was Ovilia, and she was staring at Cyril. One of the men, with a large head and big ears, saw Cyril and greeted him with enthusiasm. "Hey, Cyril, are you here to join in the fun today?" "I've found someone I like. Look at her pretty face." He touched Ophelia's face, and 2 tears fell down her cheeks. "Let me go. Don't touch me," she said stubbornly. I looked back at Cyril, whose face had turned icy. He stared at the men as if they were nothing but lifeless objects. Someone noticed his expression and tactfully asked, "If you like her, Cyril, we can give her to you." Cyril gave him a cold stare, then firmly held my hand and said, with a slight tight-lipped smile, "My fiancé is here. If you keep talking nonsense, I'll cut out your tongue." Ophelia's eyes were full of anger and resentment as she looked at me. She bit her lip tightly, and tears fell from her eyes like pearls. Her pain was clear. At that moment, the men grew bolder, using even filthier words. "Follow me, Ophelia. It'll be more comfortable than working as a waitress here. Don't be ungrateful. So many people want to sleep with me but can't. Don't you want to?" Ophelia raised her head and stared at Cyril defiantly. I just don't want to. I know the person I love will come back. No one else will do. If you dare to touch me. After Ophelia spoke, Sorel's grip on my wrist tightened with such force that it felt like he was about to crush my bones. I frowned deeply and tried to pull my hand away, but he held on tighter and tighter, his anger and heartbreak growing stronger. His desire to hurt the man in front of him was palpable, all because of Ophelia's words. The man, enraged by Ophelia's defiance, raised his hand to slap her. "You waitress! You're shameless today. I'll teach you how to behave," he said, pulling Ophelia away, preparing to leave. At that moment, Cyril finally released my hand, unable to hold back any longer. He stepped forward, swiftly kicking the man to the ground, and then grabbed a wine bottle, smashing it down with force. His anger was overwhelming, and he shouted with intense hostility, "Do you think I'm easy to mess with? How dare you touch someone who belongs to me?" Ophelia clung to his waist, crying, "Cyril, stop fighting, please." Cyril paused, turning to her with eyes that were red with emotion. "Do you think I'm dead? I'm right here in front of you. Couldn't you have asked me for help?" Ophelia held his hand and sobbed, "Who am I to you? What right do I have to ask for your help?" Their exchange, which sounded like an argument, felt more like a couple having a moment of tension. Cyril wrapped his arms around her, shielding her from anyone who might approach. That day, Cyril didn't look at me again. In front of everyone, he took Ophelia and left, leaving me alone to face the chaos. I smiled quietly, a bitter laugh escaping as I mocked myself for being so foolish. I laughed at Cyril too, seeing him as a selfish coward. Afterward, Cyril tried to contact me, but I ignored his calls. He sent several messages, trying to explain his behavior that day. He claimed that he only saw Ophelia as a younger sister, and that he was just looking out for her since she was timid and needed his care. He also reassured me that I was the only one in his heart, and that Ophelia meant nothing to him, urging me not to misunderstand. However, I later heard that he had gone to great lengths to please Ophelia, taking her to class, the amusement park, and pampering her like a child. Reading these attempts to cover up his actions, memories from the past flooded my mind. I remembered 10-year-old Cyril, fearless in the compound, yet afraid of the sickly child behind him. "Seraphina, your eyes are red. Was it the wind? Stand behind me," he had said. Then, at 16, Cyril, his school uniform swaying in the breeze, had boasted to everyone, "Seraphina really likes me. Once we're in college, we'll get engaged. After graduation, we'll get married. Stay out of our way." I moved my fingers, blocking him from my thoughts. My heart was calm now. I couldn't let it be stirred anymore. What could I do to make Cyril understand that I didn't love him anymore? Whether he chose to marry Ophelia or someone else? I didn't care. But the issue of the engagement cancellation still only existed as a wish of the Shin family. The Cyril family had yet to give a clear response. Likely because Cyril was suppressing the matter. After all, the Cyril family had always pampered him without limits. A few days later, I attended a private banquet hosted by Cyril's grandfather with my family. As soon as we stepped out of the car, Cyril was waiting at the door. The man who had always been proud and arrogant bent down in front of my parents and apologized. "Uncle, Aunt, Seraphina and I have had a small misunderstanding, but we'll work it out. You don't need to worry about the engagement cancellation," he said, his tone both respectful and subtly threatening. His words caused my father's face to flush with anger. I looked at him coldly, as though he were a piece of sticky plaster. Cyril, I said, there's no love between us anymore. Why are you holding on to this useless marriage? If it's about an alliance, there are better options than me. He straightened up and smiled, as though confident that he would succeed. Serafina, don't say things in anger. At that moment, I noticed Ophelia's figure flash behind him. He actually had the audacity to bring Ophelia to the Shin family's event. And in such a setting. What exactly was Cyril trying to accomplish? This banquet was as private as it could get. The main purpose of the old master's gathering was to persuade the Shin family not to sever the engagement. His gentle but firm tone left no room for opposition. Inside the hall, my parents were discussing things with Grandpa Cyril, while I stepped outside to get some fresh air. As I rounded a corner, I bumped into Ophelia. Her delicate face still showed traces of defiance and stubbornness. She bit her lip, tears brimming in her eyes. Miss Shin, are you really pleased with yourself? She asked. I didn't feel like responding, so I turned to walk around her, but she immediately grabbed my arm. Cyril would rather die than marry anyone else. And you're so proud of that. For your sake, he'd rather wrong me and keep me by his side without even giving me a proper status. Is this your plan? To retreat so you can advance? You pretended to break off the engagement so that Cyril couldn't have you. And now you're ready to be his legitimate wife, aren't you? I couldn't help but laugh. Ophelia, you're still so naive. After all this time, you still don't get it. I turned to face her. You're standing here questioning me. What gives you the right to do so? What's your identity? And what qualifications do you have? Her face paled and tears welled up in her eyes. She began crying pitifully. I have no qualifications. I'm just a substitute who can't even see the light of day, a despised lover. But am I wrong? I love him. Is that so wrong? Just because I'm poor and powerless, without family or status, does that mean I deserve to be humiliated by you? I rolled my eyes in silence. Cyril, you two are truly made for each other, I said coldly, attempting to free myself from her grasp as I twisted my arm. However, in the next moment, Ophelia suddenly screamed and for some reason collided with the stair railing behind her before tumbling down. I stood frozen, my hands and feet turning cold, unable to control myself. In that instant, a vivid image flashed in my mind. The memory of Ophelia falling down the stairs, her body covered in blood. I quickly regained my senses and saw that Ophelia had only fallen down a few steps. She lay on the floor, but there was no blood. Serafina, what are you doing? Cyril barged in, and his eyes swept over me, filled with anger and disgust. It's not her fault. Ophelia quickly pulled at the hem of his trousers, shaking her head. I just wanted to apologize to Miss Shen. It's because of me that you two are fighting. It's just that Miss Shen didn't want to listen to me. Cyril helped her up, his expression cold as he spoke sharply. What are you apologizing for? Who told you to act on your own? You've done nothing wrong. He turned to me. On the other hand, Serafina, you've gone too far. You should apologize to Ophelia. I walked down the stairs, gripping the handrail in frustration. A mix of anger and amusement surged inside me. I raised my chin, remembering how she claimed I had humiliated her. I was only giving her what she wanted. Let me warn you, I said. If you come near me again, it won't just be falling down the stairs next time. Cyril grabbed my arm and pulled me toward him. I'm disappointed in you, Serafina. You weren't like this before. When did you become so unreasonable? I nodded sarcastically. Yes, you're right. I'm so evil. You two better stay as far away from me as possible. Ophelia shrank back a little and looked at me timidly. I'm sorry, she murmured. I glanced at her and turned to leave, but as I walked away, my anger flared up again. I turned around and slapped Cyril twice. The sharp sound of the slaps echoed through the empty hall. Cyril, stunned, covered his face with his hand, staring at me in disbelief. Are you out of your mind? I exploded. I've been abroad, not dead. You played the game of finding a substitute. Is the Cyril family so poor they can't afford a plane ticket? You can fool around all you want, but why drag me into this? Are you both insane? Cyril swallowed hard, likely shocked by my outburst. Just as he was about to respond, a voice came from behind me. What a lively scene! I turned around and saw a man leaning against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, watching us with a lazy expression. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, and the watch on his wrist was understated yet elegant. I didn't even notice it, but he did, he said with a grin. He's a more responsible brother than we are as parents. When Cyril saw him, his demeanor instantly changed, and he calmed down. Uncle Lucien, he greeted him. Lucien didn't address him, but turned his attention to me. Who is this, he asked. Cyril quickly stood in front of me, protective. Uncle, this is my fiancée, Serafina, from the Shin family. I raised my chin slightly to look at Lucien, but as soon as our eyes met, I quickly looked away. His gaze was too intense and intimidating. I had seen it before, many years ago, but I thought he'd forgotten about it by now. After all, he didn't even remember who I was. Back when Lucien was in college, the Cyril family's patriarch had asked him to briefly teach Cyril physics. At that time, Cyril and I were only in our second year of high school. Lucien had only glanced at me when Cyril introduced me. If it had ended there, I wouldn't feel so embarrassed now. But I still remember that moment vividly. And every time I think of it, I want to sink into the ground with shame. I remembered one afternoon when I went to visit Cyril. I usually could enter his room any time, but that day the curtains were drawn, and the room was pitch dark. I approached the bed and saw someone sleeping with an eye mask on, only the lower half of their face visible. Since Cyril had said he was exhausted, I didn't think much about it and assumed it was him. I sat down next to the bed, watching for a while, and then gathering my courage, I gently touched his lips. They were soft. Seizing the moment, I leaned in and kissed him lightly. But as soon as I did, the person on the bed moved, and the bedside lamp flicked on. He removed the eye mask, revealing his face. When I saw it, I froze in shock. It was Lucien. He sat up, touching his lips where I had kissed him, then fixed me with a stare. His gaze was like that of a predator, intense, oppressive, and waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in panic. I'm sorry, Uncle, I stammered. I thought it was Cyril. Without another word, I rushed out of the room mortified. Later, I realized I had entered the wrong room and disturbed him. Despite this, none of us ever mentioned the incident again. However, from time to time, I could feel his gaze on me, watching me in silence. Since that day, I found excuses to avoid going to the Cyril family's house for tutoring. After Lucien went abroad and returned to take over the family business, I never saw him again. I couldn't help but be relieved that he didn't seem to remember that embarrassing moment. Now I stood behind Cyril, trying to figure out how to address Lucien properly. I couldn't address him as uncle since I was about to end my engagement with Cyril. I also couldn't call him by his full name, as, aside from Grandpa Cyril, no one dared to do so. While I was still contemplating this, Lucien spoke up. "Fiancé, I heard you ended the engagement. Where's the fiancé?" Cyril's face remained slightly flushed from the slaps I had given him earlier. Hearing this, he responded stubbornly. "She's the one who wants to end the engagement. I don't agree, so it won't happen." Lucien seemed to think the matter over seriously, but also rather casually, his attitude nonchalant. "Well, if she wants to break it off, let her. Our family has a tradition of doing things properly and not forcing anyone into anything." That day the atmosphere was unusually lively. When the rumor that Kane was bringing Vivian to ATT began circulating, several media outlets rushed to cover the gossip about the wealthy families. Cyril glanced over at me, unable to provide an explanation. He could only say, "Uncle, you've never cared about these things before." I scratched my palm, still puzzled. Lucien held a significant position, and it was said that he was usually so busy he hardly had time for anything else. I couldn't understand why he had the time to visit the Cyril family home today and meddle in Cyril's personal affairs. However, if his meddling could help me end the engagement cleanly today, I wouldn't mind at all. Of course, if he didn't have the time, we could still break things off after some trouble. Thinking this, I raised my head and looked at Lucien with hope. Lucien lowered his head and smiled, then addressed Cyril with a tone of light pressure. "The daughter of Jingu Industrial is on a blind date these days. She's a good match for an arranged marriage. I'll arrange everything." After saying that, he didn't stay any longer and turned to leave. At that moment, Ophelia's face drained of color. I shook my head. She still hadn't come to terms with reality. Even if Cyril didn't marry me, there would still be other women from similar family backgrounds who could marry him and support each other. If he wanted to marry Ophelia, he would have to separate from the Cyril family. Of course, if Cyril had the courage to do that, I might think more highly of him. After that day, the Cyril family quickly agreed to end the engagement. Furthermore, the announcement about the broken engagement was worded fairly, with most of it in my favor. When I saw the news, I couldn't help but think of Lucien. A few days later, my mother's gaze seemed to always be fixed on me. Whenever I caught sight of that look, I felt a prickling sensation on my scalp. As expected, she soon spoke up and asked me to go on a blind date. I exclaimed, "I just got out of a living tomb. Can't you let me rest for a couple of days?" "Mom, do you mean we can't afford to support me anymore, and that's why you're so eager to marry me off?" Oliver, not even looking up, replied, "Mom, don't rush her. I can earn money to support her. Isn't that okay?" My mother, after struggling for a long time, finally decided to pressure me by saying, "If you don't go on this blind date today, I will die." Faced with the situation, I had no choice but to change my clothes and rush to the designated location. When I arrived at the coffee shop on the top floor of the International Trade Building, the waiter greeted me with a bright smile. I noticed how quiet the coffee shop was. "Is no one else here today?" I asked. Normally, there weren't many people in this cafe, but it wouldn't usually be this empty. The waiter explained, "We won't be receiving other guests today." I silently complained about how pretentious it felt to reserve the entire place just for a blind date. However, when I saw the person waiting, I immediately reconsidered my thoughts. The man sat on the sofa with his long legs crossed, the warm light from the cafe shining on his glasses, creating a glow around the frames. I didn't expect the person I was meeting today for a blind date to be Lucian. I bent slightly to greet him and subconsciously said, "Uncle Lucian." He chuckled softly, but didn't respond. I hesitated before speaking again. "I'm here for a blind date today, but my date might not have arrived yet. I don't want to disturb you, Uncle. I'll sit over there and wait." I began to move toward a spot far from him, but Lucian called me back. "Serafina," he said. I turned around, confused. "Huh? He won't come," Lucian stated. "Who? Your blind date?" I asked. My mind momentarily blank. I nodded and said, "Okay, thank you. I'll leave now." It seemed better that he wasn't coming. It spared me the trouble of having to explain to my mother why I didn't like the other person. Lucian stood up and walked over to me, his tall figure casting a shadow over me. "What did you call me?" he asked. "Uncle," I replied instinctively. "You're no longer part of the Sorrel family," he said. "What's the point of calling me uncle?" He shook his head, and his lips curled into a slight smile. I quickly corrected myself. "Sorry, Lucien. If you don't mind, I'll just call you by your name." He maintained a distant demeanor, his movements restrained. I shook my head. From now on, the Shin family and the Cyril family would have no connection, and I didn't want any association with them. Lucien raised an eyebrow and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Serafina. I'm Lucien." His expression seemed strangely pleased, and his handsome face was touched with a hint of joy. Though the situation felt odd, I still reached out and shook his hand. I remembered how, years ago, when he leaned against the headboard, he was so captivating that he could mesmerize anyone, almost like a beauty with an unmatched charm. Now, with the added allure of maturity, he was even harder to resist. To be more straightforward, Lucien was the type of man who, once you laid eyes on him, you couldn't help but want to strip away his clothes to see what was beneath. That blind date was truly odd. In fact, my date stood me up, and when my mother found out, she scolded the person harshly. The other party stuttered and couldn't provide a decent explanation. Since that day, Lucian had been appearing more and more around me. By the time I realized something wasn't right, I was already seated in the passenger seat of his car. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I turned to him and asked, "Are you trying to court me?" Lucien steered the car, and only then did it hit me. I felt a bit of a headache coming on. I was like a prickly hedgehog, defensive. "Everyone knows about my relationship with Sorrel. Don't you think this is inappropriate?" The car stopped at the door, and Lucien loosened his tie and undid 2 buttons on his shirt. He placed one hand on the steering wheel and turned his whole body toward me, unconcerned. "Why is it inappropriate?" he asked. Realizing what he meant, I suddenly grew bolder and blurted out, "I don't want anything to do with the Cyril family. I don't want any connection with Cyril at all." Lucien was quiet for a while, considering the situation. After a moment, he said, "That's easy. I'll make Cyril leave." I replied, "That's not what I meant. It's not about who leaves. Just don't come to me anymore. Our family can't afford to climb your big tree." With that, I opened the car door and got out. Lucien followed, stepping out of the car and quickly catching up to me, blocking my path between the car and himself. "How about this?" he asked. I'll leave the Sorel family. Would that work? I only want you, Serafina. I didn't dare doubt the sincerity of his words, but I looked at him in shock. Don't go crazy. He lowered his head, his gaze lingering on my lips with a dark expression. Yet, he didn't make a move. I knew that as long as I didn't agree, Lucien would restrain himself more than anyone else. He was the best at controlling his desire for me. Right in front of me, he continued. But that's not the craziest part. Do you know what I thought when I came back this time? I was thinking about how to separate you from Sorel, but then I realized you liked him so much. If you were separated, you'd be so sad crying your eyes out. So, there was really no other choice. I thought, well, if you married Sorel, I'd secretly be your lover. I'd beg you to love me, beg you to pity me. When we kissed, I'd be gentle and leave no marks so that Sorel wouldn't find out. I stood frozen, stunned by each word he spoke. It felt like lightning striking me. Finally, I found my voice. Do you still remember that year? Of course I do, Lucien replied. I was thinking back then that I shouldn't have woken up so early. Otherwise, you could have kissed me a little longer. His words were so crazy, so unlike the usual self-controlled Lucien I knew. After speaking, he suddenly seemed drained of energy, looking helpless as he lowered his head and pressed his forehead to mine. His expression was full of sadness. Serafina, love me, okay? Seeing the proud Lucien humbled, asking me to love him, made it hard to ignore the way my heart wavered. But I didn't have the courage. My hand moved behind his back, but eventually fell back to my side. Just then, a voice came from behind us. Uncle, what are you doing here? We both recognized that voice. Hearing Sorel's voice, I tensed up instinctively. Lucien gently stroked the top of my head, whispering in my ear, I'm here, don't panic. His hand slid down to find mine, and he intertwined his fingers with mine. Slowly, he turned around, revealing me to Sorel. The moment Sorel saw me, the smile he had been wearing immediately vanished. Lucien remained calm and composed, but for some reason, I felt utterly uncomfortable, as if I were doing something sneaky. Sorel tilted his head and laughed in disbelief. Uncle Serafina, when did this start? So eager to break off the engagement with me. Have you found a better match? Serafina, Lucien, he practically growled, his eyes filled with rage. When you met her, she was my girlfriend. Lucien, nonchalant, leaned back against the car and played with my fingers with one hand. Facing Sorel's furious questioning, he replied casually, but with seriousness, Oh, I see. Sorel took a few steps forward, trying to pull me back. Serafina, did he force you? You clearly loved me so much, but after coming back, you're like a different person. I knew there had to be a reason. Is that right? I slowly let out a curse. Reason? I just don't like you anymore, Sorel. A faint voice came from behind him, and I glanced over Sel's shoulder. Ophelia was holding a pile of papers, which I immediately noticed had the words People's Hospital written on them. I quickly realized that Ophelia must have recently discovered her pregnancy. And if I was right, the papers in her hands were the test results. I felt utterly fed up with this deceitful couple. I hooked my arm through Lucien's and smiled at Sorel. Congratulations, Sorel. You're going to be a father. Lucien and I are truly happy for you, I said, emphasizing each word carefully. Cyril turned to glance at Ophelia before facing me with an emotionless expression. It was an accident. The child won't stay. Seraphina, I promise you, I'll send Ophelia away, and she'll never show up in front of you again. I made a mistake. Give me a chance. I swear I won't make you sad or hurt you again. Lucien raised an eyebrow, and seizing the opportunity, gently squeezed my hand as he replied vigilantly, "A good horse never goes back to graze where it has already eaten. It's in the past." I found it hard to understand Cyril's behavior. I had already compromised so much, yet he still pushed me. Was I still tangled in their twisted love drama? Ophelia stood behind Cyril, already looking sorrowful, but she refused to budge. "Cyril, if you don't want the child, I do. It's not just yours. How can you not want my child?" she said, her voice full of emotion. Cyril didn't look back as he replied coldly, "I won't marry you, even if you have the child. It will be an illegitimate one." Ophelia wiped away her tears and retorted fiercely, "Then I'll still have the child." "You want to take my child? Only over my dead body?" Cyril shouted angrily, "Enough! I'll leave. I'll leave here and go far away. I'll never show up again. You can be with the woman you love forever. I'll even help you." "How dare you leave?" Cyril grabbed her forcefully. Lucien and I exchanged a glance, both speechless, and I subtly nodded toward him, signaling that something seemed off with Cyril. He shrugged helplessly, knowing that whenever it came to Aelia, Cyril's attempts to juggle both sides would end disastrously, and I was often the one who got hurt. It had been the same that day when he ran after Aelia, leaving me behind. I had long known that for someone like Cyril, the more he couldn't have something, the more he clung to it. He wanted it all but could never have it. By this point, I assumed Cyril would marry Ophelia, but I later heard he had sent her away, with no intention of marrying her or taking responsibility. I didn't care where she went. At last, I had managed to stay away from the drama of Cyril and Ophelia, avoiding the same mistakes. But just as one problem faded, another emerged. At the auction, as soon as I sat down, a shadow fell beside me. Lucien turned his head slightly and offered a polite smile. I gave a perfunctory smile in return, then tried to ignore him. This was a private auction, and most of the people there knew each other, some even having past conflicts. Perhaps it was because I had recently been involved in a scandal, or because I hadn't shown up in a while. But for some reason, I had become the center of attention. The voices were not loud, but in the quiet hall, it was easy to hear them. I heard she was dumped by the Cyril family. Who knows what she did outside? Didn't they say they broke up amicably? Do you really believe that? That's just what the Cyril family told everyone, someone whispered. Otherwise, which respectable family would want to break off an engagement with the Cyril family on their own? Really? I also heard that after the breakup, a master from the Cyril family chased after her eagerly. There was a moment of silence, then someone sneered. "The nephew is used up, and then the uncle takes over." They really don't care about appearances. Keep your voice down. What are you afraid of? You know who my father is. Do I need to watch other people's faces when I speak? Someone else shot back defiantly. Hearing this, I deliberately turned to look at her. Her father had just been promoted recently. Lucien beside me was clearly not pleased. His eyes were icy. When he saw that I wasn't reacting, he asked, "Seraphina, Have you always been so tolerant? When I understood what he was asking, I replied, It's better to avoid trouble than stir it up. Lucien didn't respond, and I thought that the small incident was over. However, once the auction began, Lucien raised his bidding paddle for the first lot without even blinking, whether it was brooches, necklaces, or earrings, regardless of whether he needed them. He kept raising the price until no one dared bid higher. By the end of the auction, Lucien had bought every single item. Those who had come specifically for certain lots could only watch in frustration, too angry to speak out. It took me a moment to realize what was happening, and I asked him, Are you doing this to stand up for me? It doesn't matter to me. A few words won't change anything. He replied, It's not for you. I sat up straight, leaning against the chair, feeling embarrassed. I had been overly sentimental. They criticize you, and it's me who's angry, Lucien said, turning to look at me seriously. So, I'm standing up for myself. The warm yellow light illuminated his handsome features, and I turned my head to look at him for a long moment. I suddenly burst into laughter. What are you laughing at? He asked, reaching out and pinching my palm, causing it to itch. Darkness, silence, and uncertainty all blended together in the air. Lucien moved a little closer, his voice low, husky, and restrained. Serafina, I'm almost forgetting how it felt when you kissed me. So, shall we kiss? My fingers gripped the chair so tightly that I almost dug into it, and my heart was racing uncontrollably. When did Lucien start using his looks to seduce and tempt women? His touch was gentle, and it felt strangely familiar, like we had returned to that afternoon from years ago. After finding out I was with Lucien, Oliver gave me a look I couldn't quite describe. I scratched my head, struggling to find the right words. I couldn't say I had to take responsibility for being impulsive. Sure, lust could be dangerous, but when a usually reserved man in a cold suit suddenly reveals his toned abs and sculpted body in front of you, begging for affection, even a saint couldn't resist. I told Lucien that everything began because of lust. He chuckled darkly and replied, Lust is fine too. Anyway, you love my looks, and not anyone else. One day, when Lucien and I were leaving the villa, we unexpectedly saw Sorel, whom we hadn't encountered in a while. Lucien casually stepped in front of me and said, Go inside and wait for me. I nodded and tried my best to ignore Sorel's fixed gaze on me as I hurried back inside. Sorel watched us, waves of pain flooding his chest. He looked at Lucien and cried out like a child, just as he had when he asked for toys when he was younger. Uncle, I'm wrong. I don't know how I ended up like this, but I know I'm wrong. Could you give Serafina back to me, please? His eyes were red and his lips trembled. You know, I've been waiting for her to grow up since I was 10. My birthday? Wish when I turned 18 was to marry her. Marrying her was the biggest dream of my youth. I don't know how I lost her. Uncle, you love me most. Could you give Serafina back to me, please? The veins on Lucien's forehead bulged as he struggled to contain his anger. If Cyril weren't from the Cyril family and the only child of his elder brother and sister-in-law, Lucien would have already struck him. He barely managed to say, I don't want to hear anything about Serafina from you ever again. From now on, you'll call her aunt. Cyril collapsed on the steps, realizing at last that once something was lost, it could never be regained. Serafina wouldn't wait for him, nor would she forgive him. But he clearly remembered a time when Serafina would never leave him. I had thought the past was behind us, and we could all live peacefully. But one day, while I was sitting in a store, waiting for the clerk to wrap up my purchases, I opened my eyes and found myself tied to a chair. Horror filled me as I scanned my surroundings. There was no one around, and just a few steps ahead, I saw a cliff. For a moment, I even wondered if I was still stuck in a dream, never truly starting over. Could it be that I was still following the same tragic path, just in a different way of dying? While lost in thought, a voice interrupted me. Seraphina! I turned toward the sound and saw Sorel, whom I hadn't seen in ages. He was dressed in a black shirt and black pants, almost blending into the darkness. Sorel, I whispered, trying to keep my fear at bay. Why are we here? He chuckled softly. Seraphina, this is the only way I could think of if I wanted to see you. I took a deep breath and asked directly, what on earth do you want to do? Cyril took a few steps forward and crouched in front of me, his cold hands gently touching my face. He stared at me for a long time, before suddenly turning away. When he turned back, his eyes were red with suppressed emotion. I remember one year when we passed by a place. You told me that if I ever proposed to you, it must be under a bridge made of roses. I've prepared a bridge made of roses for you, Seraphina. I just wanted you to see it. With that, he turned me around, and as I did, a bright light suddenly illuminated the distance. A glowing bridge made entirely of roses appeared before me, looking as though it was sprinkled with stars. I stared at the scene in silence, no emotion left in my heart. The rose bridge was no longer the future I had once eagerly dreamed of. Sorel, could you let me go, and let yourself go too? I asked wearily, looking up at him. He knelt before me, his head hanging low, his bangs blown by the wind. I sent her away. I couldn't see my own heart clearly. It's all my fault, Seraphina. Couldn't you forgive me, just once? Not even once. I don't love you anymore, Sorel, I said firmly. No matter what you do, I won't turn back. He persisted. But you loved me so much before. You're lying, I replied coldly. The sound of roaring engines grew louder from the distance. Within moments, several large black cars with their headlights on arrived one after the other. Lucien emerged from the lead vehicle, his expression icy, and walked towards me, his black overcoat billowing in the night wind. When he approached, he placed one hand on my shoulder and kicked Sorel to the ground with a swift motion. After untying the ropes from my hands, he scrutinized me thoroughly, checking me over several times. Only after I reassured him multiple times that I was fine did he finally purse his lips and lift me into his arms. I rested my head on Lucien's shoulder as he carried me, glancing back at Sorel, who was curled up on the ground beneath the rose-covered bridge. Later, I learned that the Sorel family had sent him abroad. Extra story. Several years later, Sorel drove his car into the old Sorel family residence. As soon as he entered, a 2 or 3-year-old child waddled over to him, toddling towards his legs. The little one had delicate features and said in a soft voice, "Uncle." The moment Cyril saw the child's face, another familiar face flashed in his mind. At that moment, the nanny rushed over, calling out in surprise, "Master!" She knelt down and spoke to the child. "This isn't Uncle Yang Yong. You should call him brother." The child, Yang Yong, looked up at Cyril, showing his little tiger teeth, and loudly called out, "Brother!" For some reason, Cyril became irritated and told him in a low voice, Stay away from me. Who's your brother? Yang Yong, who had never been ignored by anyone in his life, huffed at Sorel's coldness and ran toward the man who had just come down the stairs. Daddy, Yang Yong said, clinging to Lucien's leg and looking up sweetly at him. That face, identical to Seraphina's, made Lucien stop in his tracks. He picked up the child, and after years of not seeing each other, Lucien now had a son in his arms. Having been abroad for several years, Sorel controlled his temper and greeted him, "Uncle." Lucien politely replied, "You're back." After that, the two exchanged no further words.